So we're starting to think about the legislative session, and the big issue that the legislature and the governor will be facing is the unbalanced budget. So in the 2025-27 budget, we saw a massive increase in spending. We saw the largest tax increase in state history, and yet even that was not enough to cover all of the increased spending. In fact, the most recent budget forecast shows that they anticipate a shortfall of $400 million. And in the November revenue forecast, they expect that to grow even larger. Now, they will point to a variety of reasons that we are having this shortfall. The number one thing that they will point to is, of course, Donald Trump and tariffs and things like that. And while it may be true that tariffs have an impact on Washington State's economy, that's far from the primary reason that we're facing this shortfall. And furthermore, the legislature left itself no room. They increased the budget and spending massively, but did not leave themselves enough leeway in a rainy day fund to make sure that if the economy changed or if bad things happen, that they could handle it. In fact, not only did they not leave that leeway, they actually had to end up cutting a number of important programs to cover the $3 billion in increased pay raises that they offered to state employee unions. So for instance, they cut funding for and spending on forest health projects in half. They had promised $120 million. They only did $60 million. And of course, every summer we see lots and lots of smoke in the air. So not only did they overspend, not only did they increase spending on pay raises, to do all of that, they had to actually cut some programs that are probably pretty worthwhile. So the result of that overspending can be seen in the supplemental budget request. So state agencies are asked to turn in their supplemental budget requests for the next session, for the 2026 supplemental budget, by mid-September. So I went through, there are about more than 500 of them, so I went through each of them to see what the requests were. And as you can imagine, there are some absurd ones, but there are also ones that really, frankly, should be funded. And the fact that they aren't funded, I think, indicates sort of how out of whack the priorities are that the legislature had in this current budget. There are certainly some things that the legislature should be funding, core services. But instead, what they did is they spent a lot of money rewarding political allies and on political agendas rather than on some basic things. So I thought I would go through, I have on my phone some of the highlights that stood out to me of both crazy spending and then spending that should be funded but wasn't because they chose to spend it all on pay raises and other things like that. But I'll start with the crazy ones. So for instance, they ask for $10 million more dollars for electric vehicle charging stations. Now, the state has numerous programs to fund electric vehicle charging stations. They have the Climate Commitment Act, they have the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which funds EV charging stations. So we are building a massive amount of EV charging stations. And for an agency to be asking for $10 million more is really absurd. We've also shown that, a bunch of the money that is being spent on EV charging stations is being spent poorly on things like solar-powered EV chargers, which cost like 7 times as much as a standard EV charger. So not only are we spending a lot, we're wasting a lot of the money that's being spent. That the $10 million should just be ignored. There's another one for $612,000 for what's called the Certificate of Need. So if you want to expand a hospital or build a new hospital to provide capacity, you actually have to ask the state permission and go through a bureaucratic process to get what's called a Certificate of Need. We've written repeatedly in the past how this is totally unnecessary, that if people want to risk their own money to increase hospital beds to treat patients, they should be allowed to do so without this very costly bureaucratic process. Not surprisingly, very few people are asking to go through this process because the barriers to creating more healthcare capacity are so high. So the state agency is actually asking for $612,000 to keep the Certificate of Need program going. Why? Because much of it is funded by fees by people who apply. And since few people are applying, there's no fees. So basically what they're saying is, nobody's using our program, please spend more on us because we're not getting any fees. If nobody's using the program, they should either A, get rid of it, but they certainly shouldn't be spending more money on something that nobody is using. There's better ways to spend that $612,000. There's also $3.2 million more to fund local climate plans. So these are climate plans that are required by the state so that they can, figure out how to deal with climate change and reduce CO2 emissions. Now, this is on top of more than $22 million that was in the regular budget that they've already passed. So this is on top of that. These climate plans are absolutely worthless. They do nothing to reduce CO2 emissions. They just analyze what the city should do and make it more bureaucratic, make it more difficult to build houses. They just add more regulation, cost, bureaucracy, but they literally make no difference in terms of meeting the state's CO2 targets. That's done by the cap. This is just regulation that is underneath that cap and on top of the tax. This money is not necessary. This program is not necessary. The legislature should get rid of it and save that money. Now, there are lots of others. I just chose those three because they stood out to me as absurd, but there's lots of other ones that are unnecessary and shouldn't be funded. The problem is, though, that there are actually some projects and some things that the legislature didn't fund that probably should be funded, but didn't get funded because, again, the priority was on pay raises for state bureaucrats. So let me just give you an example of a few things that weren't funded. Medicaid. Medicaid is asking for $460 million, Apple Health, to cover a shortfall. Now, in their request, what they said is the legislature asked us to find $460 million, or about that, in savings to make the budget balance. They said, those savings aren't there. Now, people can quibble about how much the state spends and those sorts of things. I think that there's certainly waste, but we also know that state Medicaid programs also ration care. They also, refuse to fund things that private and other insurers do fund. So there is certainly a trade-off, and whether that $460 million is the right number or not, there certainly is some level of funding that the legislature has refused to provide that is going to cause a decrease in services. There's just simply no question about that. Again, they shouldn't leave people on Medicaid underfunded. So the next example is a request for $842,000 for DCYF, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, for mental health services. Now, this money provides psychiatric help. Obviously, a lot of the people that they care for need assistance, need mental health support, need psychiatry. But DCYF reports that they haven't raised their rates for the psychiatrists and other mental health counselors that they hire since 2017, and now the rates they pay are lower than Medicaid. So they're having trouble, understandably, finding people to do the work to support their clients in their mental health needs. And in the budget request, they actually included a letter from one of their support providers. I'll just read it to you real quickly. The provider wrote, after they stopped, they said, we're going to stop working with DCYF, and here's why. The increasing demands for my services, high costs of maintaining these contracts, communication challenges with DCYF staff, the time-consuming nature of the collaboration, inadequate compensation compared to industry standards, and the resources needed to manage the contract, I have decided that it is no longer viable for my agency to continue working with DCYF. right? I think that whether $842,000 is the right number or not, clearly an agency that hasn't updated its rates since 2017 and is now less than Medicaid should be doing something. These are not, frivolous services. These are basic part of the work that DCYF does for clients, for children in these really tough situations. And the other thing is that, I think we hear all the time that, we need to have government-run healthcare or government needs to have more oversight. This is what happens when government is in charge of healthcare. They lower the reimbursement rates. They don't pay providers what they are worth or what is needed to get the adequate services to people. They ration care. That's functionally what DCYF is doing by paying such low rates, is that they are rationing care. And given a choice between less than $1 million or pay raises for state employee unions, there's no reason that this should be underfunded. This is an important service. Let me give you two more real quickly. One is eradicating, or at least funding to control, the invasive Japanese beetle. Now, the Japanese beetle destroys turf for the turf industry. It destroys fruits, other things like that. It's very serious. It's spread from eastern Washington. It's now found in western Washington. And the request is for about $12 million to undertake activities to control the beetle. Now, as we have seen with many invasive species, they do real damage. And if you let them go, then it becomes almost impossible at some point to undo that damage or to stop them. So intervening now, before it's gotten too out of control, makes sense. $12 million. Now, is $12 million the right number? Again, I don't know. But this is clearly something that is worthwhile, and the fact that it has been underfunded so significantly, I think, is an indication of misplaced priorities. Let me give you one more example of something that appears like it should be a basic service that government provides. So the Department of Corrections is asking for $6.5 million to apprehend criminals with outstanding warrants. So there are people out there with outstanding warrants who should be arrested, who should not be on the street because they are likely committing crimes or they have a criminal record. And the Department of Corrections doesn't have the staff and resources to go find those people and arrest them. And the note said that these folks people with outstanding warrants are very likely to offend. So $6.5 million, not a huge amount of money, but again, a basic service, a basic expenditure that can prevent crime and protect people's lives and protect people's livelihoods. So these are the sorts of things that didn't get funded, but seem very reasonable, seem very important for the state to fund, and should be prioritized over other things that the state is already spending money on, and yet, finding criminals who have outstanding warrants didn't get fully funded, but other things did. Let me just give you my two last favorite notes that I found in the budget requests. Oftentimes when agencies are talking to other agencies, they say things that they don't say to the public, or they admit things to each other that they don't say in public, right? In public, they want to show that they're competent, that everything is going well, that they're doing a good job. But when they're asking for money, they have to highlight where the weaknesses are, where the shortfalls are. And so there's a couple, I think, here that are very interesting, where what they say in the budget request contradicts what they say in public. The first one is for the Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reichdahl. His office is asking for $10 million for what they call math support. Now, in that request, they admit that Washington State is what they call statistically above average in the United States. Now, that's sort of a weasel because statistically means that if you use a margin of error, then we're slightly above, but when in fact we're really about average in the country. That's what the data that we've put out on our report card for Washington's future shows. And really, even if we're statistically above average, that's not really anything to brag about. We used to be in the top 10 in states in both math and reading. We have now fallen to average. And in fact, they themselves admit that in their report, where they say that our test scores have declined. And it says, Washington students have continued to statistically outperform the national average in math. However, the state's advantage has been slipping in recent years, especially between elementary and middle school. So they want $10 million. But here's the other thing that I think is interesting is that when we have highlighted that Washington's math scores have been slipping over the past decade from the top 10 now to average in the country, Superintendent Reichdahl has said, oh, no, that's just one test. That's the NAEP test, but it's not the only test. There's other things that we should be looking at as well. But in the request, here's what the Superintendent of Public Instruction's office says about the NAEP. They say that the NAEP is, quote, the only statistically reliable assessment of student progress in the U.S. where comparisons between states can be drawn. They say it's the best, and in fact, not only the best, the only one that can be used statistically to compare states one to another. Contrary to what the Superintendent of Public Instruction has been saying, where he uses other metrics to try to make it look like Washington State is doing better. Washington State students, we are not doing what we need to do for Washington State students. And it's not for a lack of money. As we have shown, spending per student has gone up much faster than the rate of inflation over the last decade, 12 years, while our numbers have been declining. So they're asking for more money. It's not so much the money that I'm interested in, it's the admission that Washington State is falling behind and that the test, the NAEP test, is the best test, both things that Chris Reichdahl has either tried to diminish or deny. There's one other thing, and this one actually is my particular favorite, which is that the community colleges are asking for about $15 million more because of utility rate increases. And they specifically mention that the state's CO2 tax, which is known as the Climate Commitment Act, and the state's wind and solar mandate, which is known as CETA, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, are both driving costs up. And they give some examples. So they say the kilowatt hour cost of electricity has increased roughly 58% since January of 2019 at Bellevue College, and is expected to continue rising. So that's what they write in there, and it's why the community colleges are asking for a rate increase. They're also asking for rate increases related to natural gas heating. Natural gas is taxed by the CO2 tax, and so costs are going up. And they specifically say that it's because of the CO2 tax that costs are going up, but then they add a note about why they're having difficulty isolating the cost of the CO2 tax so that they can identify the amount to ask for the increase. And what they say is that while the rates have gone up, and the Utility Commission has allowed rates to go up for natural gas in particular, they note that the Utilities Commission and the Attorney General's office have prohibited Puget Sound Energy from itemizing the increase due to the CO2 tax on their bill. They then go on to mention that Avista, which is in Spokane, can do it, but Puget Sound Energy can't. Now, the thing that's particularly gratifying to me is the reason that people know about that is that we highlighted it. We were the ones who saw that in the Utilities Commission ruling and brought it to the attention of the public. The fact that the Utilities Commission is trying to intentionally hide the cost of the CO2 tax. Utilities Commission actually doesn't deny that it's increasing rates. That's why it granted the rate increase. They just simply say, you can't tell the public about it. And now here's the colleges, actually the community colleges, saying specifically, this prohibition on itemizing the cost is making it hard for us to do our budgeting. So again, politics trumps good governance. And I think that's a real problem that you see in all of this. Now, so what's going to happen? What is likely to happen is that the legislators are going to ask for more taxes. As we said, we just had the largest tax increase in state history. They're going to ask for more taxes. There's already a proposal for a nearly $10 percent income tax that is going to be put before the legislature. They are still talking about what the so-called wealth tax, which is really just a tax on innovation and success, right? It taxes the resources, the investment resources that could be used to build the next businesses, but the state is going to seize those assets for its own purposes, rather than finding ways to reduce spending. What they should be doing is, first, reducing the giant pay raises that they just passed. The $3 billion of pay raises are the reason that we are in this mess. We are $400 million short. They gave about a $3 billion pay raise. We need to claw some of that back and say, I'm sorry, like, we overspent. Everybody has to, pay their portion in balancing the budget, in living within our means, and simply saying, sorry, we're not going to pay Medicaid, or we're not going to provide mental health services because we want to keep pay raises, I just think is misplaced priorities. I frankly think that's unethical. It's unethical to say, sorry, government, we're going to make the poorest, the people who do need the social safety net, pay while we give pay raises to state employees. The second thing that they need to do is take projects that are in the existing budget, not just rejecting the supplemental budget requests, but take projects that are in the existing budget and cut them. There's so many things that we have highlighted that are simply wasteful. As I mentioned, the state is spending, millions, tens of millions of dollars on local government planning for climate change. That should be cut. If local governments want to do that, they should do that. The state shouldn't be spending for something that doesn't make any sense. There are lots of projects like that that can add up to savings to put our budget in balance again. That's the way that Washington needs to get back on track. A decade ago, Washington was one of the envies of the country in terms of its business tax climate and its innovation. It is the reason Microsoft and Amazon and these other industries that are so important took off. And it's why Washington State became known as an engine of economic growth and job creation. We are losing that. Washington State's unemployment rates are consistently above the national average. We can turn that around. We know how to get there. It's not a mystery. We've done it already. Let's do it again by reducing wasteful state spending, making Washington a better tax climate, not just for businesses, but to improve the affordability for every Washington family.
If you found this informative, share it with a friend and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.